The telephone rang at 5 in the morning. My father's voice was a low, controlled thing I'd never heard before. He didn't turn around. Later, the letters arrived with holes. I learned to read what wasn't there. The man from the ministry said they knew about the radio. I said nothing. For 11 years, I said nothing. Then I opened a file.
My earliest memories of being tall. I was 5, and my uncle Werner had me on his shoulders, walking through the Mauer Park. It was October, and the air was so cold I could see my breath. He was pointing at the clouds, naming the shapes. "That one," he said, "is a two-legged elephant wearing a hat." I remember laughing, and the feeling of his hands holding my ankles, and the world from up there seemed enormous and completely safe. That was 1954. I was born Ingrid Kessler in 1949 in East Berlin. We lived at Schonhauser Alley 42, above the cobbler's shop. 3 rooms for the 4 of us. The stairwell always smelled of leather and linseed oil, a sharp, clean smell I associated with home. That smell is what I think of when I think of before. Before was Sunday afternoons. My mother would bake a Flammenkuchen, the plums from the market, and my father Karl and his younger brother Werner would sit at our kitchen table. They argued about football, Hertha, BSC, or Union Berlin. Werner was louder, always laughing, always the first to reach for the coffee pot to refill everyone's cup. Their voices filled the kitchen. It wasn't quiet, it was full. His apartment was on Bernauer Strasse. I could walk there in 12 minutes. It felt like a second home. That is the part I need you to understand before I tell you anything else. We were not dissidents, we were just a family. My father was a printer at the State Publishing House. My mother cleaned offices at the Charité Hospital. Money was tight, yes. You counted every coin. But it wasn't desperate, the regime. It was simply the weather. It was there. Sometimes it rained. You put on a coat. You didn't yet think about the fact you couldn't choose a different coat or leave the house. You just lived underneath it. Politics was something in the newspaper my father brought home from work, something in the speeches on the radio you tuned out. It wasn't in our kitchen. Not yet. Our world was measured in those 12-minute walks, in the sound of Werner's laugh, in the specific weight of my mother's cake server in her hand. I remember the texture of things. The oilcloth on that kitchen table, a pattern of red and white diamonds, worn smooth in the middle from years of elbows and plates. The sound of the cobbler's hammer below us, a steady rhythmic tap 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 through the floorboards in the late afternoons. The way my father would fold his newspaper exactly twice before setting it aside. These were the rituals. They felt permanent. They felt like they defined us more than any border could. Werner was the spontaneous one. He'd show up with a bag of roasted chestnuts or a little bar of chocolate he'd managed to find. He'd wink at me. "For you, Mäuschen." My father was more serious, more contained, but when Werner was there, something in my father loosened. He became the younger brother again, just for an afternoon. I think I knew, even then, that our apartment was small. but it didn't feel small. It felt like the center. Bernauer Strasse was an extension of it. I knew the route by heart, out the door, past the cobbler's window with its single polished boot on display, left at the kiosk, straight down until the buildings changed color. I'd count the streets, 4 streets away. That's all it was. I could have done it with my eyes closed. I thought I always would. That's what a child believes, that the geography of your love is fixed, immutable, that an uncle is always 12 minutes away. The world was those 4 streets. It was the park and the kitchen table and the smell of leather rising up through the floor. It was my father's ink-stained fingers and my mother's tired smile when she took off her shoes. It was the certainty that Werner would be there on Sunday. That was the whole map. Nothing had been taken yet. Nothing had been cut in two. We were just a family. And for a long time, I think we believed that would be enough to protect us. That the simple fact of us sitting around that table was a kind of fortress. We were wrong, of course, but you have to remember how it felt before you knew that. You have to remember the safety of not knowing. The weather changed slowly. So slowly you could almost pretend it hadn't. A comment my father didn't make. A letter that didn't arrive. A look between my parents when a certain news bulletin came on the radio. The coat you put on against the weather became heavier. You started to notice you were always wearing it, but that came later. For those years, my world ended at Bernauer.
I woke because the silence was wrong. Not the silence of sleep, but the silence of a held breath. And then a voice. My father's voice. It was 5 in the morning, the 13th of August, a Sunday. His voice was not the voice I knew. It was low, controlled, a register I had never heard from him before, as if he were afraid the walls would hear. I got out of bed, the floorboards cold under my bare feet, and crept to the hallway. He was on the telephone. His back was to me. He did not turn around. He stood like that for a long time, listening mostly, saying only ja and wer stehe, and once, very softly, mein Gott. I watched the line of his shoulders. They did not move. When he finally hung up, the click was so final it made me jump. He didn't turn. He just stood there, one hand still on the receiver. I went back to bed and pretended to be asleep when he passed my door. At the kitchen table, my mother had already made coffee. The smell should have been normal. It wasn't. My father sat down heavily. He told her the Volkspolizei and the army had sealed the sector boundary overnight with barbed wire. They had started at 1 in the morning. Bernauer Strasse, he said, Werner Street. It was on the other side now. He had tried to call Werner at 4. The line connected just once. Werner said, Karl, I can see soldiers from my window. and then the line went dead. My father stirred his coffee. The spoon did not make a sound. My mother said, "But he can come here." "He can still come here, can't he?" My father looked at her. He didn't answer. That was the answer. I dressed for school. It was a Monday. You still went to school. That was the first rule you learned, life continues. The S-Bahn ran. The trams ran. My mother packed my satchel. She didn't say a word. At school, our teacher, Frau John, wrote the date on the blackboard in her perfect cursive. 13. August 1961. She turned and began a geography lesson. The river systems of the Soviet Union. The Volga, the Don, the Dnieper. She drew the curves on the map with a long wooden pointer. No one mentioned the wire. No one mentioned the soldiers. Every child in that room knew. You could feel it, a current running under the desks. Every face was turned slightly toward the window, as if expecting the view to have changed. At recess, we filed out into the yard. No one ran. A boy named Dieter, his face pale, said his grandmother had been trying to cross at the Bornholmer Strasse checkpoint since dawn. The guards had turned her back. She lived in Wedding, in the west. She had come to visit on Saturday, and now she could not go home. We stood in a loose circle. We did not know what game to play. We just stood there, 12-year-olds, under a grey Berlin sky, understanding in our bones that the world had become a different, smaller place. The bell rang. We went back inside. That evening, my father stood at our apartment window, the one in the living room that looked southwest, toward Bernauer Strasse. He stood there for 2 hours. He did not speak. He did not move. My mother eventually put a plate of cold cuts and bread on the table. She said his name. Karl. She said it again. Karl. A third time. He turned then slowly, as if waking. He sat down. He did not eat. He looked at the plate as if he did not recognize what food was. That was the first time I understood. The letters began arriving in the autumn of 1961. They were the only thing left of my uncle. My father would bring them home from the post office at the end of his workday. He wouldn't open them at the door. He would hang his coat, put his briefcase down, and then carry the letter to the kitchen table. He'd sit. He'd turn the envelope over in his hands, feeling the weight of it, examining the stamp, the postmark. Then he'd hold it up to the light. every time. He was looking for the break in the seal. The State Postal Service opened everything. They read everything. And then they closed it again, but never quite right. The glue was always slightly wrong, a different shade, or the crease was in a new place. My father examined these flaws the way I imagine a doctor reads a chart. I learned to read his face first. The slight tightening around his eyes told me more than any words inside ever could. They developed a code, he and Werner. They used the names of old friends from their football team. Heinz sends his regards meant things were normal. Werner was well. Heinz has been unwell meant there was a problem, something they couldn't say. The letters themselves were objects of strange beauty and tension. That thin, almost translucent paper. Werner's handwriting, which I remembered as large and looping, became cramped and precise, every millimeter of the page filled. He was trying to fit a whole person into a space that kept shrinking. The sentences were about the weather, his job at a print shop, asking after my schoolwork. But between the lines, in the pressure of the pen, I could feel him shouting. The first one with a hole arrived in the spring of 1963. I was 13. My father opened it, performed his usual ritual, and then went very still. He didn't say a word. He just laid the page flat on the table. There, in the middle of Werner's cramped writing, was a blank rectangle. A paragraph had been cut out with scissors, not blacked out with ink, removed. The paper was just gone. My father stared at that hole for a long, long time. The kitchen clock ticked. Then he said, very quietly, they cut out Hilda. He was right. The sentences before the hole were about Werner's work. The sentences after were about the weather. The missing part was about his wife, my aunt, and their new apartment in Charlottenburg. My mother, drying a plate at the sink, made a small sound, like a breath caught on a hook. That was the moment I understood. My aunt's existence, the fact of her life in a particular flat on the other side of the city, was considered dangerous information. A state secret. Something that needed to be scissored out of our family story. I started writing letters too. Letters I never sent. I kept a school notebook, and I would write to Werner as if he could hear me. I told him about the boy in my class who got in trouble for asking why, if socialism was winning, we had to keep building a wall to keep people in. I wrote about the empty feeling in our apartment on Sundays, the space where his laugh used to be. I wrote everything I actually thought. Then I would fold the pages tight and hide them in a tin behind a loose brick in the courtyard wall of our building. I don't know why I did it. Perhaps I needed someone to be honest with, even if that someone was only Werner in my imagination. A Werner who couldn't be censored because he never received the letter. It felt like digging a very small tunnel, one sentence at a time. The official letters, the ones that made it through, became a kind of ghost language. We weren't reading the words anymore. We were reading the gaps. The absence of a familiar name. The sudden jarring switch in topic. The weight of the paper where a photograph should have been but never was. My father's replies were masterpieces of nothing. He wrote about the health of his geraniums. I remember the exact shade of blue. The shirt was a stiff cotton, the color of a winter sky just before the snow falls. I put it on for the first time in the autumn of 1963. I was 14. The pin went on the left side, just over the heart. It was cold against my skin. My teachers had recommended me for the Erweitert Oberschule that spring, the extended secondary school, the path to university. My father came home from work, put his briefcase down, and read the letter of recommendation twice. He nodded. He said, "This is good, Ingrid. This is very good." He was proud. My mother washed the dinner plates at the sink and did not turn around. I could see the tension in her shoulders. Later, she said to me very quietly, "Just remember who is giving you this path." I didn't understand her fear, not then. I felt chosen. There is a seduction in that. When a system points at you and says, "You are useful," it is a powerful thing to hear at 15. So I joined the Freie Deutsche Jugend. It wasn't a decision made with conviction. It was a transaction. You wore the shirt, you attended the meetings, you learned the language. Socialist construction. The planned economy. The heroic struggle against imperialist aggression. I learned to speak it fluently, this second language that had nothing to do with the life in our apartment, with my father's silences after the mail arrived, with my mother's hands kneading dough as if she could press her worries into it. I could recite the correct answers in political education class with a face of calm attentiveness. I felt nothing. That was the skill you learned. To feel nothing about the words coming out of your own mouth. The cost of the performance. That came into focus one Tuesday. A girl in my class, Renate, She had a laugh that was too loud for our classroom, the kind that made teachers glance up. Her father had applied for an exit visa to emigrate. He had family in Hamburg. She was absent for 3 days. When she returned, her FDJ pin was gone. Just the tiny holes in the fabric of her shirt where it had been. Our homeroom teacher, Frau Weber, moved her seat. Without a word, she pointed to the back row. Renate gathered her books, her face blank, and walked to the new desk. No one looked at her. No teacher ever mentioned it. At lunch, she sat alone, every day. I watched her from my place at the table with the other girls from my study group. We talked about our biology homework. I never went to sit with her, not once. I told myself it would draw attention. I told myself it wouldn't help. I was a good student. I was learning. The double life became a kind of instinct. You carried one set of thoughts here, another set there. The border was internal, but sometimes the two worlds almost collided. I remember a political education lesson. Our youth leader, a fervent young man named Comrade Schiller, asked us to name examples of West German propaganda we might encounter. He wanted us to be vigilant. My hand was already half raised, and the phrase that came to my mind, the one I almost said aloud, was from Werner's last letter. It had slipped through. He'd written about the so-called economic miracle over there, the quote marks faintly ironic in his handwriting. I caught the words in my throat. I felt a cold flush spread across my chest. I lowered my hand, waited a bit, and when another student gave a bland answer about capitalist advertising, I nodded along. The near miss left me shaky. It wasn't just a memory, my uncle on the other side. It was a liability. A flaw in my file that I could not erase. My future, the university place, the path they had given me, it could all be closed off because of a phrase in a letter, because of a man I hadn't seen in years whose voice I could barely remember. I was 17 when I learned my father had a second brother. Not a real one, of course. But the man who lived inside the broken Telefunken set in the back bedroom was a version of my father I had never met. A man who took risks. He'd been listening to RIAS for years. I'd heard the name, whispered at school like a swear word. Rundfunk im amerikanischen Sektor. The voice from over there. But this was different. This wasn't just listening. On certain Sunday evenings, at a certain time, on a frequency he'd written down on a scrap of paper he kept behind a loose floorboard, he would transmit. He would speak to Werner. The first time he let me stay, he didn't explain. He just nodded toward the doorway. My mother was already sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands folded so tightly the knuckles were white. The room was dark except for the faint green glow from the dial. My father crouched on the floor, his back to us, a silhouette against that small illegal light. He turned the knob. The static was a physical thing, a rush of white noise that filled the small room. Then he adjusted it, a tiny movement, and the static cleared to a hiss. We waited. I remember the sound of my own breathing too loud. I remember the precise second the hiss broke, Werner's voice. It came in bursts, distorted, fighting through the interference. But it was him. I hadn't heard his voice since I was 11. 6 years. He said 3 things. That Hilda was well, that he had a job at a printing company, that he thought about Carl every Sunday, then a pause, filled with crackling, then over. My father didn't speak. He held the radio with both hands, his head bowed as if in prayer. When the static returned, solid and final, he reached out and clicked the set off. The green light died. We sat in the dark. I could hear the faint sound of a television comedy from the apartment below us. It felt like a betrayal, that laughter. After several minutes, my father said, "He sounds older." I looked at the curve of his spine under his shirt. I thought, so do you. The terror was a taste in my mouth, metallic for the rest of that evening. Department 3 of the Stasi monitored the airwaves. Everyone knew a story, or knew someone who knew a story, about an arrest for shortwave contact. My father's precautions were a ritual. Always Sunday, when most people were watching their own state-sanctioned television. Always under 3 minutes. He would time it on his wristwatch. Afterward, he would dismantle the connection, hide the smaller unit back inside the Telefunken shell, and screw the wooden panel shut with a specific screwdriver he kept wrapped in cloth. He would push the heavy set back against the wall, exactly 2 fingers' width from the skirting board. Meticulous. I know now it was probably all useless. If they were listening, they heard. Our building was old, the wires in the walls. But the ritual was the point. The ritual was what kept the fear at a manageable level. We were performing safety. And yet, within that fear, there was a kind of intimacy I have never found again. The 3 of us in that dark room. My mother's silent vigilance. My father's total focus, his ear almost touching the speaker. Me in the doorway, neither fully in nor out. The static was a wall, and for a moment Werner's voice was a door in it. He would say, "The weather is clear here," which meant he was safe. Or, "Remember the chestnut tree," which was a code I never learned. For those 2 or 3 minutes, my family was not a family divided. It was a circuit completed. A current flowing from Bernauer Straße to Schönhauser Alley, under the ground, through the air, bypassing the wall entirely. Then the static would return. The door would shut. My father would let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for the entire transmission. And we would become what we were, 2 brothers separated by concrete and wire, and a daughter who was learning that love, in our country, was often a secret you kept from the state. I began to listen for other things. Not the codes, but the background. Once I heard a dog bark on Werner's end. A real West Berlin dog. It was the most ordinary sound in the world, and it felt miraculous. Another time, there was the faint chime of a church bell in the distance before he began to speak. Those details were more dangerous than the messages. They made the other side real. Not a political concept, but a place where dogs barked and bells rang. The weight of it settled on me. I was good at keeping secrets. I had learned that at school. But this was different. This secret lived in our home. I remember the first time I walked into the Pädagogische Hochschule. It was September 1967. The building was new, concrete and glass, and it felt like walking into a machine designed to produce a specific kind of person. I was 18. I had my place. To get it, I had needed a recommendation from my FDJ district secretary and a background check by the school's party committee. I passed both. I remember holding the acceptance letter and feeling nothing at all, not relief, not excitement, just a transaction had been completed. The training itself was a strange dance. We learned pedagogy, child psychology, mathematics, and we learned the socialist interpretation of every subject. History was a procession of class struggles culminating in our own state. Literature was a tool for building the new socialist personality. You had to master both the content and the code. You had to learn to speak in 2 registers at once. I was good at it. That was the problem. I was very good at it. In my first week, I was called to the office of the SED party secretary. His name was Genosse Hartmann. He was a man in his 50s with very clean glasses and a voice that never rose above a polite conversational level. He gestured for me to sit. On his desk was a single manila folder. He did not open it. He began by welcoming me, praising my academic record, my FDJ service. Then he said, "There is, however, a small matter." He said, my father's employment record at the State Publishing House was, in his words, not without complications. I knew immediately what he meant. 1963. My father had refused to typeset a pamphlet denouncing a colleague. He'd received a disciplinary note. It was 4 years old. Hartman said this was not a barrier to my studies, but it was a question mark. A question mark, he said gently, that I could help to resolve by demonstrating my own reliability, my understanding. He let the silence sit between us. I understood what he was asking. The request was not even direct. It was an understanding to be reached. The compromise I made was this: I agreed to submit quarterly reports. Not on individuals, I told myself, just on the general political atmosphere among my fellow student teachers, impressions, mood. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself everyone did it. I told myself the information was too vague to hurt anyone. I have spent 30 years testing those arguments. They do not hold. I wrote the first report in my dormitory room. The lamp cast a small pool of light on the paper. I described a general commitment to socialist ideals. I noted a healthy curiosity about pedagogical methods from the Soviet Union. I wrote that the collective spirit was strong. It was all true in its way. It was also what they wanted to hear. I signed it. I dropped it in the internal mailbox. It felt like posting a letter to my own future. Life continued. I attended lectures. I practiced lesson plans. I had friends. One of them was a boy named Matthias. He was from a village near Rostock, clever, with a dry sense of humor. We shared a table in the library sometimes. One afternoon, he was frustrated with an assignment. He leaned over and said quietly that he'd heard a report on a Western broadcast about something called the Prague Spring. He said it sounded to him more accurate than what Neues Deutschland was printing. He said it just to me, just once. When the next quarterly report was due, I sat at that same desk, the blank page. I wrote about the general atmosphere. Then I added a sentence. I wrote, A student in the second-year cohort has expressed uncritical interest in Western reports concerning events in Czechoslovakia. I did not use his name. I told myself I was being careful. I told myself I was protecting him. I was protecting myself. 2 weeks later, Matthias was called before the disciplinary committee. He was not expelled. His teaching placement was reassigned to a rural school in Mecklenburg, as far from Berlin and from his family as it was possible to be within the Republic. I watched him pack his things in the corridor. The application form was a single sheet of off-white paper. I remember the color because it wasn't the usual grayish pulp. It felt official, like a birth certificate. My father filled it out at the kitchen table, his fountain pen moving with a slow, deliberate care I hadn't seen in years. It was 1972. The basic treaty had been signed. There was talk of a new normal, of small openings. He was applying for a one-day visitor permit to West Berlin to see Werner. He mailed it. And then we waited. Not with hope exactly, but with a kind of suspended breath. For 11 months. The refusal came on a Thursday. A different piece of paper, this one, the standard grey. The reason was typed, "Professional history presents unresolved questions." My father read it aloud, then turned it over, as if the explanation might be on the back. There was nothing. Which questions? They didn't say. They never do. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He made tea. The silence in the kitchen had a texture that afternoon, thick and dry, like dust. Werner's response arrived a few weeks later, not through the post, but via a church charity that ran a courier service. A parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a book, a hardback copy of Goethe's Faust. My father knew immediately. He took it to his bedroom and closed the door. When he came out, he was holding a photograph. He'd had to slit the spine with a razor blade. The pages had been hollowed out to make a cavity just large enough. It was a clever piece of smuggling. I thought, Werner always was the clever one. The photograph. It was black and white, but you could feel the sun in it. Werner and Hilda standing in front of their apartment building in Charlottenburg. Werner's arm was around her shoulder. They were both squinting, not that Hilda's hair was lifting in a breeze. On the back, in Werner's handwriting, Sunday, May 1972. We are well. We think of you every day. My father kept that photograph in his wallet from that day until the day he died. The edges became soft as cloth, the corners rounded. It lived behind his identification card. I think he looked at it every day, a private ritual. Taking out his ID to show a bus conductor or a shop clerk, and there, just behind it, his brother's face in the sun. My own reaction when I first saw it surprised me. It wasn't grief or solidarity. It was jealousy. A sharp, petty, undeniable sting. Not of their freedom, not in a political sense. I was jealous of the sunlight. The quality of it. It fell on Werner's face without apology. It was bold. It carved shadows under his chin and made the brickwork of the building behind them look warm and solid, unhurried. I had never seen light like that in Pankow. Our light was different, paler, diluted by the perpetual haze from the heating plants, filtered through net curtains. I was 23 years old. I had never been to West Berlin. I had never been anywhere. The borders of my life were the S-Bahn ring. And in that photograph was a world where the light was a possession, something you could stand in and own. That evening, my father did something he never did. He took the photograph out of his wallet and propped it against the salt cellar on the kitchen table. He didn't say anything for a long time. We ate our soup. The radio played light orchestral music. Then he said, Werner and I used to walk to the Wannsee in summer. We did it every year from when I was 15 until the year you were born. He took a sip of water. I have not been to the Wannsee since 1949. He said it plainly. No self-pity, just a statement of fact. And that was worse. That was when I understood. My father had been grieving for 23 years. For a lake, for a walk, for a... The nomination came through in October. Deputy headmistress. It was a small school in Pankow, but it was a step, a real step. My father bought a bottle of sparkling wine. We didn't open it. We were waiting for the committee review. 3 days before it, the call came to the school office. I was to report to an address in Mitte, not my district office. A different building. The room was on the 3rd floor. A metal desk, 2 chairs. Hauptmann Fischer introduced himself, but not with a handshake. He had the file open before I even sat down. He was a man who had perfected a tone of administrative regret. He told me my father had been under surveillance for a period of years. He used the phrase treasonous transmission of information. Paragraph 100. He said the word shortwave and the name Werner in the same sentence, and I felt the room tilt just slightly. The information was already in the file. He was showing me the edges of it. Not to scare me, he said. To inform me. A prosecution was possible. Then he paused. He straightened the papers. He said there was a way to resolve the matter. If I could confirm the details, the frequency, the schedule, the content. If I could do that, the file could be administratively closed. My father would face no charges. My promotion would proceed. He gave me 48 hours. He did not say what would happen if I refused. He didn't need to. The reel-to-reel recorder on the shelf in the corner was enough. I left the building and walked for an hour without knowing where I was going. The arguments began immediately, rehearsed in my own voice inside my head. He is 61. His heart is not strong. A trial would kill him. They already know everything. You are just confirming. You are not telling them anything new. This is not a betrayal. This is a transaction. I did not sleep that night. I lay in bed and watched the pattern of headlights from the street move across my ceiling. At 2 a.m, I put on my coat and walked. The streets of Pankow were empty, completely empty. The sound of my own footsteps on the wet cobblestones was the only thing. I walked past the school. I let myself in with my key. I sat on the polished wood floor of the gymnasium in the dark under the basketball hoop. I tried to think clearly, to weigh it. My father's freedom against my silence, my future against his past. But that wasn't it, not really. It was my comfort against his risk. I had built a life within the walls they built. I knew how to move within them. This promotion was a part of that life. He had chosen, years ago, to keep a connection they had forbidden. He had made his choice. Now I had to make mine. The second evening, I went to his apartment. I didn't go to tell him. I went because I thought I might find an answer in his face. He made tea. We sat at the kitchen table. He talked about a novel he was reading, something by Fontaine. He mentioned the early frost, that the geraniums on his balcony had turned black overnight. I said nothing. I watched his hands as he poured the tea. the slight tremor he developed, the way he held his cup with both hands to keep it steady. We talked about my school, about a difficult pupil, normal things. The whole time, the words were screaming inside me. They know about the radio. They have a file. They want me to confirm it. I said none of it. To tell him would have been to force him to carry the decision with me. I already knew I couldn't do that. When I left, he stood in the doorway. The light from the hall fell on his slippers. He said, "The autumn of 1989 was a season of waiting. I had been deputy headmistress for 11 years. My father was 72, and his breathing had a sound to it now, a kind of dry rustle. The shortwave radio had been silent for over a decade, ever since my meeting with Fisher. I had never given him a single name, not in so many words, but I had sat in his office and let my silence confirm what he already knew. That was enough. The file was satisfied. Werner's letters still came, still sometimes arrived with a sentence blacked out, a word missing. The wall was a fact of my life. It was the color of the sky. You don't question the color of the sky. Then, in October, we watched the Monday demonstrations in Leipzig on the school's communal television. The staff room was quiet. Hundreds of thousands of people in Karl Marx Platz holding candles. The police were just standing there. They weren't moving. And the party spokesman on the television, his voice. It had no weight anymore. It was just a sound. I felt something loosen inside my chest. A knot I had forgotten was there. It wasn't hope. Hope was too big a word, too dangerous. It was just a loosening. The night of the 9th of November, I was at home. My father was asleep in the back room. There was a knock on my door. My neighbor, Herr Becker, he was standing there in his slippers. He said, "They've opened the checkpoints." I told him he was mistaken. He shook his head. I turned on the radio. The newsreader was speaking in that same hollow voice. I put on my coat. I didn't wake my father. I just walked out. I walked to Bornholmer Strasse, the same checkpoint. I remembered Dieter from school in 61 saying his grandmother had been turned back there. Now, there were thousands of us, a river of people. The border guards stood to the side. They looked, bewildered. The barrier arm was up. People were just walking through. No one was running. There was no shouting. It was eerily quiet, just the shuffle of feet on the cold ground. I moved with them. One step, then another. And then I was on the other side. I stood there for 20 minutes. I didn't know what to do with my hands. People were laughing, crying, strangers hugging. A West Berliner handed me a bottle of champagne. I shook my head. I just stood. I looked at the shop windows, so full of light and color it hurt my eyes. I looked at the cobblestones under my feet. They were the same cobblestones, but they weren't. I felt nothing. Or I felt everything at once, and it amounted to the same thing, a perfect stillness. I found a phone box. It was past midnight. I had Werner's number memorized, a sequence of numbers I had carried for 28 years and never dialed. I put in the coins. I listened to the ring. It was a different sound. A clear, sharp ring. He answered. Werner, it's Ingrid. Karl's door. I collected the file on a Tuesday morning in January. The woman at the counter handed me a cardboard box. It was heavier than I expected. I carried it to a reading room. There was a long table, plastic chairs, and a light that hummed. I opened the box. Inside was a stack of paper, maybe 300 pages, bound with a string. I untied it. My hands were steady. I remember thinking, my hands are steady. I had put it off for 4 years. I told myself I was busy, that the queues were long, that it didn't matter anymore. But I knew. You know things you haven't allowed yourself to think. The truth was already there, a shape in a dark room. I just needed the light to fall on it. My IM designation was on page 12. Inoffizieller Mitarbeiter, unofficial collaborator. The words were typed in a neat, bureaucratic font. They looked so small. They took up so little space. It wasn't just the meeting with Fisher in 1978. The file showed me what I had done in aggregate. The quarterly atmosphere assessments from my student days, which I had told myself were harmless. A note from 1974 about a colleague who borrowed my radio, and the faint telltale crackle of RIAS I heard once when I turned it on. I had mentioned it, just in passing, to my FDJ group leader. I'd forgotten. The file hadn't. A parent's complaint about the political curriculum in 1981. I reported the conversation, not the parent's name, I was sure of that, but the file had the name. And Matthias. His name was there. My report, they said, had confirmed existing concerns about his political reliability. He was transferred to a school in Mecklenburg. He never finished his teaching certificate. I had carried that for years as a private guilt. The file made it public. It made it official. It made it a line item. 16 years. I was a useful and reliable source for 16 years. That was the phrase they used. Zuverlässige Quelle. Reading it was like watching a slow-motion film of a collapse. Each page was a brick. I had carried them one by one, thinking each was separate, manageable. The file stacked them all together and showed me the wall I had built. It was worse than any single act had felt at the time. At the time, it was survival. It was a calculation. It was protecting my father. In the reading room, under that humming light, it was just a list. A chronology of complicity. I finished reading. I retied the string. I put the pages back in the box. I walked out into the January cold. I carried the box home. I put it on my kitchen table. It sat there for 2 months. In the spring, I went to see Werner. My father had been dead 2 years. Werner was 70. He had a bad hip and still lived in the same Charlottenburg apartment. I brought the file with me. I told him I needed to tell him something. We sat in his living room, the afternoon sun coming through the window, catching the dust in the air. I told him everything. About Fischer, about the reports, about Matthias, about the 16 years. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He just looked at me, his old face quiet. When I finished, the room was very still. I could hear a clock ticking in the hallway. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Did you know they had a file on Karl too?" I hadn't known. I hadn't even considered it. His was 280 pages, Werner said. His voice was soft. He reported on 3 of his colleagues at the publishing house between 1958 and 1963, before the war. I just sat there. The sun moved across the floor, so we were both informers. My father and I, we were both trying to protect ourselves and each other, and we never told each other, and we each thought we were the only one. I said that to Werner. He nodded. He said, "Yes." Then I said,